Good evening, and the news tonight. How money actually works.
Private banks create money out of nothing and lend it at interest.
Modern civilization's reliance on oil with no major change in sight.
But what we have now is this area where there's no more ability to produce cheap energy. We're at the peak. We're on the downslope of oil production. No way you're going to get any more out of the ground any faster.
Monsanto's growing control over natural food.
The price these companies pay decades later is a fraction of their profit.
The war on drugs, or making profit and controlling people's minds.
You never see positive drug stories on the news, do you? Isn't that weird, since most of the experiences I've had on drugs were real fucking positive.
This is now the third time Wall Street has crashed. The third time the system has failed. And this time, we will not get out. The global debt is sliding out of control. The struggling middle and working classes will now bear the brunt of paying off this debt. Major increases in national debt throughout history have come from cutting taxes on the rich and corporations. This is done with the assumption that it will lead to greater prosperity for a nation. The term coined for this ridiculous practice is called voodoo economics. Instead of a country paying off its debt, it keeps people in a perpetual state of wage slavery and gives tax breaks to corporations. This is how the gulf between rich and poor has increased so rapidly, mainly during the time of the Reagan and Bush administration, who practiced voodoo economics. But what is debt? What is money, for that matter? Since everyone's lives are controlled by it, the whole of the monetary system depends on banks and money. But how does it actually work? Or more accurately, repeatedly fail?
Banks do not take your money and then lend it out to others with interest. They create money out of thin air and then charge you interest on this made-up money. Inflation will then naturally occur because of the perpetual increase in the money supply which is required to cover the interest charges to keep the system going. Bankruptcy or collapse then follows because the interest, which is impossible to meet, 4. It does not exist in the money supply. This constant growth paradigm means real wealth and resources have to be harvested and dumped in order to allow the system to keep running. If everyone right now tried to pay off all of the debt of the world, we would still come up short, with interest still not even touched.
This is only a symbol. This doesn't mean anything. It's fiat. It's created out of thin air because somebody turned on a printing press. That's all it is.
The fact is, most people think that what a bank does is lend you money that someone else has put in the bank previously. But what a bank actually does, what a commercial bank does, is to create money from nothing and then lend it to you at interest.
Private banks create money out of nothing and lend it at interest. Now, that sounds absurd. When I teach sophomores, about money and banking and how banks, they never believe it. And so you have to go through it again and again. Yes, banks really do create money. They really do. Here's how it happens. And it's absurd, and they're right to doubt that could possibly be what's really going on.
When you base a system on something that doesn't actually exist or have real wealth, you get all kinds of distortions. Like GDP, the measurement of a country's money gained from products sold. Guns, bombs and ammunition to cause destruction and war are included in this. Private contractors to fix the destruction caused. Letting companies take natural resources, burn them up, destroying ecosystems for paper notes. Then there's using money to control entire countries by putting them into everlasting debts with interest payments.
It's not that Bernie Madoff was a pyramid scheme or Stanford was a pyramid scheme. The whole economy is a pyramid scheme. The whole global economy cannot be sustained. It requires infinite growth.
The top 7% gained a whopping $5.6 trillion in net worth between 2009 and 2011 due to the bailouts, while the rest, the bottom 93%, lost $669 billion. Their wealth went up by 28%, while ours went down by 4%.
Ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour.
Our economics correspondent, Liam Farrell, joins us now in the studio. People may find it hard to believe that money can just be created. How did this come about?
Money originally started as paper credit notes representing gold held in a banker's vault. This was logical in one sense. Putting aside the fact that gold has no real value, it cannot be eaten or drunk, it's just a scarce shiny metal, so it has good applications for use in barter. The paper notes were directly related to the amount of gold in the vault. Since bankers realised that no one comes back for their gold, they prefer the paper notes, it is highly unlikely everyone will come back at once. That's known as a run on the bank. So bankers just started making claim checks on gold that wasn't there. The interest on this gold that didn't exist made bankers very wealthy. All the fake claim checks allowed for Europe to become very prosperous. So instead of outlawing this practice, it was legalised and regulated. Limits were set on the amount of fictional money that could be sent out by bankers. The rate is usually 9 to 1, and this is our modern fractional reserve banking. Then in 1971, Nixon ended the dollar as a receipt for a fixed rate of gold and brought in fiat currency. Worthless pieces of paper called legal tender can now only be used in exchange for items because the government said so. The translation of the Latin word fiat is, let it be so. You may not get gold for your money because it has been created out of debt when you make a promise to pay back to your bank on taking out a loan.
So what would this mean for homeowners gone into debt, struggling with mortgage arrears, and having the banks threatening to take away their homes?
Well, people should really do research into their mortgage and what rights the banks have to take away their homes. For nearly every loan made by a bank is not only counterfeit, but is not legal consideration for a property. Take a court case in 1969 in Minnesota involving a man named Jerome Daly, who was challenging the foreclosure of his home by the bank which had provided the loan to purchase it. His argument was that the mortgage contract required that both parties, he and the bank, put up a legitimate form of property for the exchange. In legal language, this is called consideration. Mr. Daly argued that the money was not the property of the bank since it was created out of nothing as soon as the loan agreement was signed. As I mentioned earlier, when banks make loans, they accept promissory notes in exchange for credits. The actual money reserves are unchanged. The bank is simply inventing this new money and putting up nothing of its own. As the court case progressed, the bank's president took the stand, and in the judge's personal memorandum he recalled that the plaintiff, the bank's president, admitted that it, in combination with the Federal Reserve Bank, did create the money and credit upon its books by bookkeeping entry. The money and credit first came into existence when they created it. Mr. Morgan admitted that no United States law or statute existed which gave him the right to do this. A lawful consideration must exist and be tendered to support the note. The jury found there was no lawful consideration, and I agree. Only God can create value out of nothing. The court rejected the bank's claim for closure, and Mr. Daly kept his home. Unfortunately, these kind of cases are suppressed by the media, which only acts as an attention shifter, drawing the public's focus on what they want.
If there is a case for how corrupt the government is, it is with the history of marijuana legalization.
In talking in highfalutin language about freedom and democracy and going around imposing it on other countries, when in our own countries we cannot even make decisions about our own consciousness.